So welcome back to another video here in Pennsylvania. What's going on? There's white stuff on the ground. Yeah, it's snow. We've had hardly any snow this year. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting to see this up here. Down in the valley, there's no snow. I guess it was just all rain. So I didn't, when I got to the top of the mountain here, on the section of the Appalachian Trail here, my home county, Berks County, boom, there's all this snow. So it's kind of nice. I wasn't expecting it, but here it is. I think it's the most snow I've seen this year. Well, in my part of Pennsylvania. Back in November, when we were at Fort Dewart, they had quite a bit of snow out there. That was out in Bedford County, or maybe in Somerset County, right on the border there. That was the most snow. A couple inches out there, so. But hey, you know, today is March 13th. Winter is not over. We're prone to get snow, big snowfalls even, the rest of March, even into April sometimes, unfortunately, which might happen. But enough talk of the snow. I've got another story to tell you regarding the French and Indian War here in Pennsylvania. Of course, in the past, we've talked about some of the different Indian raids and the captives that were taken and some of their stories. We told the story of, was it Marie Leroy and Barbara Liner? They were taken captive during the Penns Creek Massacre, which is, I think, the first video I filmed in this series. We told their story, and then I think recently, well, I forget when we told the story of Mary Jemison, their captive. I think she was a captive of the Great Cove Massacre, and we explained her story. She never left. Marie and Barbara did escape at some point, but Mary Jemison decided to stay with the Indians. But Mary had her reasons. She had a family, she had children. If I remember correctly, she had two different husbands from the Native Americans, from two different tribes. So she decided to stay with her family, with her children. But we have another story to tell to you today. The story of Jacob Smith. So the story of James is an interesting one. He was adopted into Native American society as an older person. And when I say older, I don't mean like my age, but probably in his upper teens. A lot of the captives that were integrated into Native American society of the captives were much younger, but sometimes they did adopt older individuals too that were in their teens. Not too often the guys either. They're often ones who got killed during the raids and stuff, but I think James and his brother were out somewhere. We'll read it in a moment, but I think his brother was killed and scalped and stuff like that, but they took James captive. And he tells the story in his own words. He did survive the captivity. He tells in his own words what we'll call the adoption process that he went through. He didn't realize at the time that he was going to be integrated into Native American society. He thought he was being prepared ritualistically to be killed, but they were preparing him ritualistically to be a part of their society. So it's kind of interesting, kind of a side of things we haven't seen yet in this series. So I'm going to find a place here. I think I might find a spot to settle down and read the story to you. An interesting spot here. Yeah, there are some random chairs and stuff by a campfire here. Like I said, I was hiking along the Appalachian Trail, which is out that way, but there was a sign for a camp up this way, so I think I'll try to scrape some snow off and we'll have a seat somewhere maybe, and I'll read this story to you. Alright, so this is from the book Historic Tales of the Pennsylvania Wilds, and I've read stories from this book before. The story of Mary Jemison came from this book as well. So this is a story of James Smith, because this book is by Kathy Myers. If you're interested in it, got a few interesting stories. But that's what I'm reading from. And sometimes James and some others like him were referred to as white Indians because they were adopted by the Indians and kind of grew up in their society for a while. And some of them actually had trouble, I guess you could say, going back to white society. Some went back, decided to move back in with the Native Americans rather than stay with the whites. So let's read about James' story here. So James Smith, a famous Pennsylvania captive, wrote of his encounters with the Indians between 1755 and 1759. Those are the years that he was a captive. Some 44 years later, some 44 years after his escape. He did not make clear whether he participated in Indian raiding parties during his years in captivity. So that's one thing he never really talked about, because if he was, adopted into Native American society, did he take part in raids, against his own people? It's kind of an interesting thought, because if he was one of them. All right. Adoption was a common practice among the Indians. A captive would be given to someone who had lost a loved one. In James Smith's account, he detailed his experience of being forced to run the gauntlet in the process of his adoption. I think we talked about that before. A lot of times they would take captives, because the Indians raided the white settlers, but the settlers also raided the Native Americans as well. So as a result of those raids that the settlers did on the Native Americans at times, or either the local militia and stuff, so the Native Americans would lose family members too. So in order to get family members back that they lost, they would take some of the settlers as captives. They would adopt them into their society. So if a family lost a son in battle, in one of the raids, in order to get a son back, they would take one of the settlers' sons as captives. That's kind of the way it worked. Alright, so let's continue reading. Getting some water droplets on my book here. You might hear a little bit of traffic too. I try to get it far away enough from the highway so we didn't hear it, but I still hear a little bit. Maybe you don't on camera, but anyway. So Smith was captured in May of 1755 while working on a road near Bedford, unaware of any danger as he was traveling with a companion. Smith was attacked by 3 Indians who were hiding behind a blind. Smith's companion was shot and scalped. Smith was taken captive, forced to run across Pennsylvania, out to the western part of Pennsylvania. Smith and his captors reached Fort Duquesne after several days. As they approached the fort, he heard shouts from the Indians and thought there must have been thousands of them, which was not the case. Just all this shouting sounded like there's a bunch of them. All right, seeing Indians dressed in breechcloth and moccasins running towards him, imagine that, Smith thought he would be killed. I mean, yeah, you see a whole bunch of Native Americans running towards you with, tomahawks and stuff. You think, well, this is it. Instead, the Indians formed 2 lines. Smith was forced to run between them while they struck him with switches, hatchets, or their fists, a practice known as running the gauntlet. After Smith was knocked to the ground, unconscious, the next thing he remembered was waking up in the fort, Fort Duquesne, and being tended to by a French physician. So picture that. You think, I think that was the end too. You're taken captive, you saw your companion shot and scalped, they're taking you to this fort, see all these warriors running towards you with hatchets and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, you would think, well, this is it. Next thing you know, you wake up and you're in a fort being tended to by a doctor. All right, but let's continue. After a period of recuperation, Smith was taken to a town in the Ohio Territory. When he arrived, Indians gathered around him. One began pulling the hair out of his head by dipping his fingers in ashes in order to make a firmer hold of it. The Indians pulled until all the hair was out of Smith's head, except for a small spot, about 3 or 4 inches square, on the crown of his head. This remaining hair was trimmed, and 2 locks were wrapped around with narrow beaded band, and the other was plaited down its full length and adorned with silver. Next, his ears and nose were pierced, and he was given jewelry for each. Following this, Smith was ordered to strip and put on breechcloth. His body was painted with several colors, and a large belt of wampum. Let me switch pages here. And a large belt of wampum put around his neck, and silver bands on his hands and arms. The old chief then took him into the center of the village and gave out a halloo alarm, which brought the town of Indians running. So once again, I think he thought this was gonna be the end, that they were ritualistically preparing him to be killed. The chief held Smith's hand and made a long speech, obviously which Smith didn't understand. At the end of the speech, he gave Smith to 3 young squaws, which took him to the bank of the river. Sure that he was going to be drowned, Smith resisted until one of the squaws who could speak some English told him, "No hurt you." He was then dunked in the water and washed. When he came out, he was taken to the council house where he was given new clothes, moccasins, again painted, and then presented with a pipe and tomahawk. The chief noted that he was then of their flesh and that all his whiteness had been washed out of his blood. So James Smith became an adoptive of an Indian tribe. So you can imagine all that would have been quite a shock to go through all that. Imagine having your hair pulled out, all kinds of stuff, and then they're painting you, dressing you up, piercing your nose and ears. You kind of had to wonder, what's going on. Like in his mind, he was probably thinking they're preparing him to be killed in a ritualistic fashion, if I could talk. But in the end, they're just preparing him for adoption into the Native American society. So it's kind of interesting. A little bit more here I'll read to you. James Smith escaped captivity in 1759 and resided in the Coconocheague Valley in Pennsylvania, where he became a farmer and married Anne Wilson in 1763. In 1764, he joined Colonel Bouquet in his expedition to the Muskingum River to return the captives. This was after Pontiac's War. Smith represented Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania in the Constitutional Convention of 1776, and he joined the Pennsylvania Militia as captain during the Revolutionary War, eventually achieving the rank of colonel. After his first wife died in 1778, he moved to Westmoreland County, where he remarried. In later years, he and his family settled in Bourbon County, Kentucky. So there you go, the story of James Smith, told out here in the woods of Pennsylvania, right by the little camp area. Actually, I probably should have had a little campfire. That made it even more nice setting for it. But yeah, you can see the chairs and the stuff stacked back there. Didn't realize this was going to be here. I knew there was a campsite back here, but anyway, that worked out. So yeah, I know James did write other books about the Native Americans because he lived amongst them for a number of years. And like I said, he never really talked about, you know, a whole lot of what he did with them. Like, did he participate in any raids with them? Not that he would have wanted to, but, you know, when you're integrating their society, you almost, like, you kind of have to. I don't know, it's kind of hard to know what all they made him do. Maybe there's just things he didn't want to remember, or things that he didn't want to admit that he did. So, and we all tend to do that, just not talk about certain past events that we'd rather not remember. Anyway, but we'll never know. He did die in 1813, I believe. He passed away. And I don't remember anything being said about whether or not he married in their culture there, had children. So when he escaped, did he leave a family behind? And like I said, I'm pretty sure, I don't remember reading exactly how old he was in any of the stories, but if he was out, you know, working on building a road, he was probably, you know, at least in his older teens. So it's kind of interesting to think what he left behind when he escaped. All right, so there you go. Just another story, another perspective on the war. Like I said, we've told other stories about other captives and what they experienced. And, you know, some of the captives, like I said, were killed right away. Some were kind of adopted, but not treated so well, used more as like slaves. I think Marie Leroy and Barbara Leininger experienced that, and some of the people that were with them, they weren't really treated well. Like I said, they were made part of the society in whatever town they were adopted into. Not really adopted, but just kind of used as labor and stuff. Whereas it seems like others, like James, were actually adopted as they made them Native American. Like I said, they washed his whiteness away. The idea he was now of their flesh, fully adopted in their society. So the captives all experienced different things, different stories. So it's kind of cool to read a story of someone who experienced something a little different than the others. And it turned out to be quite a beautiful setting today to tell you this story. Like I said, I wasn't expecting the snow up here. I thought it'd just be wet. But yeah, quite something I haven't experienced a whole lot yet this winter here in Pennsylvania, so it's nice. So as I continue to find other stories about the French and Indian War, not just the history, but I like telling the stories too, the people. So we'll keep having story time every now and then out here in the woods as I tell you stories about the people who actually lived during the time of the French and Indian War and experienced it. But I think that'll be it for me then, folks. I'm going to head back down into the valley where there is no snow. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching, folks, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one, wherever that may be.